First of all, my name is Chenjerai Kumanyika. I am a professor here in the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. I'd like to extend a welcome to all of you. First of all, I want to extend a welcome to my journalism students in investigating journalism. For those of you who haven't been up to this part of the journalism department, welcome. And I know that there are several others who are also here as part of the NYU community. Thank you for gathering for our presentation today, covering the Israel-Gaza War, how can journalists navigate the minefield of facts, propaganda, and historical context. Quickly, one note to my journalism students. If you're here, make sure that you check in with Nyanika, with the TAs, so that you can get marked for attendance. That's important. So let me just say, let me start this way. As of March 11th, 2024, the Committee to Protect Journalists' preliminary investigation showed at least 95 journalists and media workers were among the more than 31,000 killed since the war began on October 7th, with more than 30,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza and the West Bank and 1,200 deaths in Israel. The Israel Defense Forces told Reuters and Agence France Presse News that it could not guarantee the safety of their journalists operating in the Gaza Strip after they had sought assurances that their journalists would not be targeted by Israeli strikes, according to a Reuters report. And just among those journalists that have been targeted, 95 journalists and media workers, including 16 journalists reported, well, not including, but 16 journalists reported injured, 4 journalists reporting missing. And these are journalists that are, you know, as I just was describing, across different ethnicities and nationalities. But, you know, yeah, that's not to say that those deaths are equally divided. So for that reason and many others, I think that this is an absolute humanitarian disaster and something that is an important news item that needs to be covered and engaged with. It also poses all kinds of confusing questions for journalists. And in that case, it's both, you know, those questions are things that need to be answered both as an educational pursuit, but also just so that journalists and others can do the work that they need to do, journalists and educators. And so for that reason, we're joined by 2 guests that I'm really excited to have here to help take us through that. And I will introduce the guests. They will each, I mean, I've given them sort of an impossible task, right? Like I've said, cover this massive thing, which has all kinds of history and all kinds of dimensions, and you have 20 minutes each to do it, right? Which just feels like impossible. But they have agreed to try. And so we'll give them each 20 minutes or so to handle it. And then I will bring you, and then I'll bring you in for a Q&A. Before I introduce our guests, let me just say that I want to just respect the fact that this is a very sensitive issue. For people who come from various perspectives on this issue, this is not theoretical. People have, you know, there's real casualties. And so I hope that we can together proceed as a community in a spirit of respect, in a spirit that we're not going to agree on everything, but we can respectfully and in good faith ask questions and engage each other and learn together so that we can move forward and do what has to be done. And you know, anybody that is not in that spirit, we're going to ask to not participate. All right. Our first speaker is Rami George Khouri, is a Palestinian-American academic and journalist whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Nazareth. During his 50-year career in journalism in the Middle East, he founded and managed the Islam Affairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs and the Global Engagement Initiative at the American University of Beirut. He has been a Harvard Nieman Journalism Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Fellow of the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs in Arab East Jerusalem. He is now a Distinguished Fellow at IFI-AUB and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and writes weekly op-ed for Al Jazeera Online on Gaza and the Western media. During his journalistic career, he published an internationally syndicated column, edited the Jordan Times and the Beirut Daily Star newspapers, and wrote from the Middle East for the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, while contributing commentaries at NPR, BBC Radio, and others. He's also published books on archaeology, history, and the Jordan Valley. And let me just say that, you know, in the little time that I've had a chance to exchange with Rami, he's really sensitive, caring, and sharp person to take us through these issues, who really is, I think, interested in the pursuit of truth. Before I welcome Rami, one other thing I just neglected to do that's really important. I want to thank everybody who helped to put this on. Thank you to Lisa Lorang, thank you to Adrian and James, to Tom Sawyer. I mean, you know, everybody. You know, I'm sorry, not Tom Sawyer. I'm sorry. So thank you to Tom for doing this. And just it takes a lot of work to make these events happen. It's important to get those thanks there. So, but with that, I want to bring Rami up, and you know, I think that part of how we're going to enter into this conversation is through who these journalists are and how their experiences inform how they approach this issue. Thank you. Rami, if you would prefer to sit, you can sit. Pardon? If you want to prefer to, would you prefer to stand or sit?
No, I'll speak from
Okay.
here, and we'll sit in the Q&A later. All right. Here we go. Thank you, Chenjerai. And thank you all for being here and all those who helped to organize it. And it's a great thrill to be with Tony and Azadai and a few other people that I've interacted with here at NYU over the years. The topic that we have 20 minutes to talk about is one that I've spent 50 years dealing with, and I'm writing a book now on the last half century of the Middle East, in which I was there living and working and chronicling what was going on. The book I'm writing is really to try to capture for younger people, especially like you and others in the region and abroad, what happened between 1970 and 2020. An incredible half century of drama and change and action and positive and negative things that happened in the Middle East. One of the constant elements throughout the half century that I covered, and I traveled all over the Middle East. I lived mostly in Lebanon and Jordan, but went to Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, all over the place, Iran. But there was two constants. One was the conflict between, known as the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is at a deeper level a conflict between Zionism and Palestinian Arabism, going back a century. And after the creation of the State of Israel, we refer to it as the Arab-Israeli conflict, because Arab states got involved as well as the Palestinians. And the second constant was foreign military forces coming into the region. It used to be the British and the French years ago, and then after World War II, you got more of the American forces, as they are there now, coming in and fighting against various people. And then you had regional forces developing. Iran, Turkey, others around the region started becoming involved. And then you had the most dramatic, I believe, the most dramatic development of the last half century in terms of the conflicts of the region, which is the emergence of non-state armed actors like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Ansarullah or the Houthis in Yemen, and groups like that that are not sovereign countries, but that are armed, that have tremendous power, in most of these three cases I mentioned, more power than the states in which they emerged, from which they emerged, Lebanon, Palestine, and Yemen. And the non-state actors, armed actors, have formed a regional alliance called the Axis of Resistance, they call it. They're very closely aligned to Iran, and they're very active all over the region. And that's the most recent major new development. So these big sticker items, the Arab-Israeli conflict, foreign militarism, the emergence of new powers, are the backdrop to a constant half-century of warfare. But I think to understand this situation in Gaza today, you really have to go back a full century. And in 20 minutes, of which I've used up probably 4 or 5, you can't go over a lot of details. But the reality of understanding Gaza, the Gaza-Israel, the Hamas-Israel war, however people like to refer to it, I just call it the Gaza-Israel war, because it's more than just Hamas. To understand it, you have to understand the whole century, why this happened. From both sides, why did Hamas carry out its very vicious attack on October 7? Why did the Israelis retaliate with their very vicious retaliation, which is still going on? Why are so many Western powers deeply involved in the conflict? Why are some people around the region supporting the Palestinians, others supporting the Israelis? There's a whole range of different questions which are not easy to answer and make it very difficult for journalists, especially if you're a foreign journalist, but also if you're a local journalist, trying to cover this situation. So how do you navigate this minefield of events, of actors, of causes related to what's going on in Gaza today? And now we're at the situation where the United States is coming in with some other countries with a floating dock, and they're going to use it to bring in aid. So things keep changing. Every few weeks there's a new dimension to this. So the most useful thing I can do to shed light on this is share with you some of my personal experiences. Over, like I said, 50 years. I was born in 1948, the year that Palestine was partitioned, Israel was created, the Palestinian exile started, refugeehood, and the conflict reached its first major landmark, which is 1948. In the previous 50 years or so, there were many events that happened that help explain why that happened in 48. Why did the UN decide to partition the land? A land that was in 1917, when the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which promised that they would support the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine, for a homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people, when England didn't even have actual title to the land, but still that's how colonialism works. Why did that happen in 1917? What happened in the next 20 years in terms of internal tensions between Jews and Palestinians? As Jewish immigration increased, tensions and clashes increased. The British got involved. There was a bit of a chaotic situation from the 1930s to 48 between the British, the Jewish armed groups, and the Palestinian indigenous majority population. And then 48 happens, and there were many, many factors in that whole process. So I tried to describe it as in basic terms without being judgmental as much as possible. But of course, every word that you or I use in describing the situation will be seen as judgmental by somebody else. So if you're going to be working in this arena or any arena in a complicated conflict, the first thing you have to do is pay attention to the words. What words do you use? How will your words be understood? If you say a terrorist act or a militant act or a violent assault or whatever term you want to use for what Hamas did, any words you use are going to be challenged by somebody. So be prepared to defend your words. And the way that you best defend the words you use to choose to describe the events that you're reporting on, whether you're a reporter, documentary filmmaker, podcaster, feature writer, book writer, whatever you do, whatever kind of journalism, straight news, whatever you do, you really need to prepare carefully which words you use to describe what's going on. But to do that, you have to start with two other serious deliberations. And these are deliberations that happen within you, not within Palestine or Israel or Washington or Iran or anywhere else, within yourself. You have to look at your professional dimensions and you have to look at your personal dimensions. There's always going to be a conflict and a clash between the personal and the professional dimensions of your reporting or journalistic life when you are in a battlefield, a conflict situation. So you have to start by asking things like, what's the story? Or what are you writing? What are you reporting? I say writing because I'm a writer, but I see most people today do video and film and audio and all kinds of other multimedia, or animation, all these newfangled things that I appreciate, but I've never done them myself, most of them. But the basic point is, why are you doing this? Why are you covering this story? What's the purpose of your journalism? And why did you put yourself in a situation where you have to navigate this minefield? You better have an answer to that. And it can't be, well, I needed a job and this was available and they asked me to do this. Which, if you do that, you're going to get in real mess. Because this is a issue of heightened tensions and accumulated historical traumas, massive fears, intense and expanding suffering, and very complicated linkages to people all around the region and all around the world. So you better have a good reason to enter into a situation like that. And again, it may not be Palestine. You might decide to go report on the Rohingya, or you might want to report on Nepal or Cyprus or some other conflict situation in the world. But the first thing is you have to decide what's the story. What is it you're covering? The second thing you really need to ask yourself is, what do your audiences need to know about this story? The third thing you need to ask yourself is, what's your role and responsibility as you do your reporting journalistic work? And you need to be able to answer the personal and the professional dimensions. So when I say personal, I mean things like, are you working as a journalist or are you working as an advocate? Are you advocating a cause? Are you doing propaganda and public relations and publicity for your cause? So I'm a Palestinian. I've been dealing journalistically with Palestine all my life. I have my obvious views, but those views are about my personal relationship to the question, to the topic that I'm writing about. At what level do I do advocacy? At what level do I try to just identify, verify, and pass on facts to the audience? Like, a clash took place today and so many people were killed on both sides, or so many babies died of starvation today in northern Gaza, or so many Israeli hostages we think died today in captivity. Those are facts. And if you can verify them, and in most cases you can, if you can verify them, then you're pretty sure that you'll be pretty safe in passing them on to your audiences. But even facts have an advocacy role, because you can decide which facts do you want to pass on. Do you want to pass on the fact that so many babies died of malnutrition and starvation in Gaza today and just leave it at that? Do you want to say why they died of starvation, who prevented them from getting food, What were the different actors in this drama? The Palestinians, the Israelis, the Americans, the British, the Iranians, whoever you want to look at. What was their role? These are really complex, multifaceted issues. So just even a straight fact is not what it seems to be. Because facts in situations of conflict are loaded with emotion and historical baggage. But still, you need to go through the process of deciding what is your personal link to this story, why are you doing it, and how does that impact your professional responsibility. And then the professional responsibility, it sounds pretty straightforward, that you say, well, I want to report about the conflict between Israel and Hamas, or the people in Gaza, whoever they may be. When you just start with that broad goal, you say, okay, what are you reporting? You're reporting events, what happened yesterday. Let's say you're a daily newspaper or an evening news broadcast. I guess now, my days, we only had evening news broadcasts on TV. Now you can have 24-hour news broadcasts. So are you trying to just report what happened in the last 24 hours? Are you simply trying to convey the facts of how many people died on both sides? Or are you trying to go beyond that and replicate the environment in which this happened? Who caused the deficiency of food? Who caused the continuation of the fighting? Who might have been responsible to bring about this situation of lack of medical care? You have to decide if that's part of the story or not. And then you have to make a huge decision. Is it your job as a journalist to capture, chronicle, classify, analyze, vet, confirm, and then pass on to the audiences the human emotions behind these events on both sides, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side? And then you have also the American side, because the massive American support to Israel. You have people supporting Hamas from their perspective. Is it your job to capture those emotions and pass them on? Is it your job to go beyond just saying, well, this is what happened yesterday. These people were fighting. So many died on each side. So many bombs were dropped. So many missiles were fired. And then you have to ask, is it your job to identify the legal and the political and the ethical dynamics that underpin these facts? The political and the legal and the ethical dynamics, and each one is a separate category, but they're all important. Is it your job to just say, look, this is what happened yesterday, and I'll be back tomorrow with another report of what happens in the next 24 hours? Or do you see it as your personal or professional duty or responsibility, or maybe just your interest and desire? To go beyond that and say, you're reporting what happened, you're touching on the political and legal and ethical dimensions, and you're capturing the human emotions on both sides, which are intense and have gone on for 100 years. And because they've gone on for 100 years, they're so intense. And that link between the past and the present, the longevity of this incredible conflict, that's 100 years of Zionism and Palestinian Arabism fighting each other, or Arabs and Israelis fighting each other, or however you want to call it. Is it your job to go to the next step and to say, well, I want to see what I can do by reporting these events and the people and the causes and the consequences? Maybe I want to go to the next level of trying to play a role as a journalist to help push the region and these people to a better future for all of them. In other words, are you going to start exploring possibilities of ending the war, peacemaking, whatever, reparations on both sides if they're appropriate. And then you have an even more complex question you have to ask yourself. Is it your job, your professional job, or is it your personal inclination to actually try to contribute to repairing the damages of the traumas of the past? The Israelis and the Palestinians are two traumatized people. They both had serious historical traumas, different scales, different places, different times, but with the same consequence, that they both feel that they were savaged and ravaged and denied their fundamental humanity in various places over time, and they want to try to overcome that and live a life of normal peace and quiet and having all the rights. They both have those identical feelings, but each in their own context. Is it your job to try to repair some of those historical traumas that linger so deeply? And then finally, the big question that is more and more important today, are you just trying to report facts to your audience? And I showed you the complexity of some of these facts. But is it your job also to cater to not just your audience, your readers, your people who watch or listen to your journalism, but maybe your advertisers, maybe your donors, maybe the boards of trustees of the organizations you work for, maybe special interest groups and societies, lobbies and NGOs and advocacy groups that support you or support the other side if you identify with either side. Do you have any link, professionally or personally, with these other people who are out there and who impact the world of journalism and can make or break your institution in many cases? And what you do might also make or break your career in many cases. If people don't like what you're doing, you might lose your job. So these big questions, these are just, probably 20% of the issues. We don't have a lot of time to go over a lot of them, but I wanted to lay them out quickly. In the last 5 minutes I have, I want to tell you how I've tried to deal with them. As a Palestinian-American, a child of 1948, my whole life has paralleled the history of the modern state of Israel and the history of the modern exile, disenfranchisement, and statelessness of the Palestinians. I got involved in this very early on in college here in the United States when I was about 18 years old, and I've been engaged with it nonstop, and I still am heavily today engaged in lectures and teach-ins and meetings and private meetings, public meetings, debates, panel discussions with Israelis, pro-Israeli, anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, anti-Palestinian groups, all kinds of different people. And my sense of the most useful thing for me to do as a journalist, which I learned very early on at the age of 18 to 20, by being engaged with activists here in the United States on both sides, as well as third-party Americans and others who were not either totally with Israel or totally with the Palestinians. I learned that the most useful advice that I, as a person and as a professional, could implement or put into practice came from one of the greatest Jewish people of all times, which was Moses. And in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses tells the Hebrews, as they were preparing to enter the Promised Land, he passed on a message from God that he passed on many messages, but the most important, universal and lasting, I believe, is the message to pursue justice and only justice. The pursuit of justice strikes me as the most effective and useful mechanism by which you can guide your work as a journalist, that you're trying to do your job as a journalist to report the facts and all the other things I mentioned, the emotions, the legal side, the history, all these other things that are so important. But you do this because you believe this is a journalist's contribution to the pursuit of justice in any society. If you're reporting on Black Lives Matter, if you're reporting on Me Too, if you're reporting on environmental justice, doesn't matter what you report. If you're reporting on the basketball NCAA championships coming up, March Madness, doesn't matter what you're reporting on. You've got to report in a way that is as accurate as you can make it and that serves the cause of human, political, societal, national, and international justice. That's an easy thing to say. And justice is like love. It's hard to define, but you know when it hits you. You know when you're unjustly treated. And you feel the injustice. You don't just read about it, you feel it in your bones. And Israelis and Palestinians have both had a lot of experience with this, more than either of them deserve. But there are still injustices that need to be resolved. And Gaza accentuates how important this is right now. So I'll finish with just the last point that I would make, is that there are no easy, quick answers to the questions of how you navigate this minefield. Because this is a question that has faced people throughout recorded human history. Even before there was journalism, you had novelists, you had poets, you had all kinds of people, religious people trying to navigate this. Every one of us has to rediscover the dynamics of contributing to the promotion of justice in our society and also in other societies. And that means justice for everybody. Justice for you and justice for your opponent in any conflict that you're in. Justice cannot be divided for one side or the other. The only permanent solution to any of these conflicts is one that gives both sides their minimum basic demands, while each side has to make some compromises on some of its demands to reach that situation where the conflict ends. And we've seen conflicts end in South Africa, Northern Ireland, other places. So I'll leave you with the words of Moses, in the wisdom of the book of Deuteronomy, and leave it for you in your journalistic careers to experience these challenges, but also to address them. Don't be afraid of them. Tackle them head on. Don't try to shut people down if they start talking about something you don't like. Don't try to criticize people if they wear something you don't like them to wear, or utter phrases that you don't like to hear, whichever side you're on, but engage them. Listen to them. Understand why they're saying what they say. Feel their trauma, and then they'll feel your trauma. And finally, maybe, if you have great teachers, as you do, and you have great institutions, as most of you do, you will be able to move ahead in this arena and get us out of this terrible situation we're in today, where the expression of emotional trauma and fear and tension by people on both sides is responded to by shutting people down. So what we need to do is hear the views of all people and then figure out how we can best move ahead to address the underlying causes of what brought them and us here. So good luck in your careers, and I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A period.
Wow, thank you so much, Rami, for those really wise words and those sharp questions. I actually want to jot those questions down myself to think through every time I'm reporting on something. And I should say, by the way, that you know, I can speak on, you know, for my students here, we have some real stars in the room with us, people who are eager to go out and do journalism and make change, and so I'm really excited. Our next, and thank you. Our next speaker is Tony Karon. Tony is the editorial lead of AJ Plus, the Al Jazeera digital video brand publishing on social media platforms. He's been with Al Jazeera for 10 years, and prior to that spent 15 years at Time magazine, where he was a senior editor. Born and raised in Cape Town, South Africa, he was an activist in the anti-apartheid liberation movement throughout the 1980s. He's lived and worked in New York for the past 30 years. And again, you know, like I can say, you know, in my conversations with both Rami and Tony, I mean, just they have very kindly just, you know, filled my head with all kinds of new information and perspectives that is important. So Tony, welcome. And by the way, folks, I know you have questions that are coming up, so please note those, because we're going to have a Q&A afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Chenjerai. It is always a great honor to be on any platform with Rami. Rami is a legend. Let me just share that with all of you. When I was at Time magazine, looking for voices of sanity and clarity in a region that I was covering from a great distance, Rami was indispensable. Particularly, I found very moving the piece that I think Chenjerai shared with the class, the piece written during the 2006 invasion of Lebanon by the Israelis, his challenge to Israeli journalists on the question of ethics. Of course, my Jewish learning, I'm a Jewish South African, by the way, by origin, as Chenjerai said. We didn't say the Jewish part. The Jewish part for me that gets engaged by what Rami was putting out there was very simple. Hillel, the great sage, Hillel, anybody know? Not Hillel, the institution on campuses, but the actual rabbi, philosopher, thinker, challenged by a Roman soldier during the Roman occupation, if you will define your religion while standing on one foot, I'll convert. Back then, there was proselytizing by Jews. The matriarchal lineage thing hadn't been adopted yet. Big, long story. I can very easily go down rabbit holes. Don't let me. What does Hillel say? It says that which is hateful unto others do not. That which is hateful unto yourself do not do unto others. All the rest is commentary. Okay, that is my basic Jewish ethical sense. That is how I read ethical situations. Anything I do, anything that is done in my name, I have to think about its impact from the perspective of those it's going to affect. So, yeah, I'm not representing Al Jazeera here. I'm speaking for myself. I'm AJ Plus. I'm immensely proud to be part of a network that is sacrificing literally life and limb to bring the story of people in Gaza, that is living the story of people in Gaza. And yeah, we talk about legends. Like I'm totally humbled to be in the same organization as people like Wael Dahdouh, who you might have seen on your social feeds, people who are basically probably going to die, or quite possibly going to die, because they are that committed to bringing that story. And yeah, I mean, that's a profound honor, but I think it also talks a little bit about what Jazeera is as a brand. So, and particularly AJ Plus, the part that I work for, which is the social media version, which is a little bizarre because I'm a print journalist. But really, what I'm going to do here is talk personally, but also give some sense of how we answer the questions that Rami's setting out. And it's a distinct set of answers that applies to us as a brand. It's not it's something for you to think about, digest. It's not any instructional manual. It's not going to help you get a job at the New York Times, probably, sad to say. I mean, if that's your objective. And yes, I mean, a moment of sympathy to all of you looking for jobs in journalism, because it's kind of like the priesthood. It's more like a calling, something you do because you can't help it, because, you know, it's taking a vow of poverty in a way. Yeah, it's a tough time. It's a tough career to think about. Don't go in there expecting material comfort and rewards, but the rewards are emotional, and the rewards are basically that when, on the rare occasion when you can make a difference, that's why we become journalists. So I want to talk a little bit about the question of the choices that we make in our journalism and how those contrast perhaps with the conscious choices we make versus the probably often unconscious choices that are made in kind of mainstream Western coverage when it comes to a story like Gaza. The personal story, how I got here, is not insignificant because I don't know how much you've done on the sort of view from nowhere, but I really don't think anybody in American journalism after Black Lives Matter, there was this moment of like, okay, wait, there's been a bit of a myth cultivated here over many, many decades that there's this kind of neutral above the fray view from nowhere that, journalists are just sharing the facts and don't sort of come from anywhere in particular. I think of, this is going to sound like a bizarre analogy, but Whole Foods has a ethnic foods aisle. Have any of you noticed that? Okay, what does that tell you about, white people, I guess, or the majority of their customers don't have an ethnicity. There's a little ghetto where the pozole is, and those are kind of unconscious choices of of an imagined point of view, right? But I think it's more significant, obviously, when it gets to journalism. So I think we have to understand where journalists is coming from, what has shaped us, the values, and the biases, if you want to call them that. When I think about bias, I think it's about values. Certainly my news organization is 100% politically independent. We owe no allegiance to any government, movement, political party, personalities. But we're not morally neutral. We're not morally neutral in the face of oppression, in the face of racism, in the face of all manner of sort of violent systems of exclusion. It's like, if you were looking at US media in the mid-19th century and you were adopting a sort of view from nowhere about slavery, well, you could imagine if you adopted that model, it's like, well, some people say slavery is good for the economy, it's efficient. Other people say slavery is morally wrong. Who's the New York Times? I mean, let's not say the New York Times. Any establishment newspaper in the 1850s talking to? Are they hearing from enslaved people? Are they, no, it's like a group of people in the name of this view from nowhere talking about is slavery good or bad for America? But who's excluded from that conversation? And what does that conversation permit in terms of any sort of moral clarity? Obviously, that example is hideous if we think about it, but it's worth noting. It's worth noting what the sort of pretense of values-neutral journalism potentially leads us to. So, as Chenjerai said, I came of age within the liberation movement in the ANC in South Africa in the 1980s, and that told me something about choices. It told me about, I grew up as a privileged person in a settler colonial apartheid system. The ANC taught me that I had the choice to renounce and fight to dismantle that system, and that dismantling that system was actually liberating for everyone. So that basic value of the absolute equality of the value of all human lives, I think, informed our politics and informs certainly my journalism. So I had been a left Zionist before I realized that that's not really possible. But in growing up in segregated suburbs, it was the only politics. The Zionist youth movement was the only politics I had access to, and I'd sort of embraced this sort of utopian socialist idea of kibbutz. We were going to defeat capitalism because they did teach me some basics about capitalism, which was very good. We were going to dismantle capitalism by creating these communes, on land that just happened to be vacant, and we would just go there and build these socialist communes, and that's how we'd build a better world, and the light would shine unto the nations, and everybody, capitalism would just collapse in itself. Of course, there's a whole lot of fantasies there, fantasies about the Nakba that Rami lived through. So, I was told, no, Palestinians just magically upped and left in 1948. They heard some radio broadcasts from Jordan, and they were like, oh, okay, we'll get out of here. Because, people do that. They just up and leave their homes because of something they might have heard on the radio or something. It's patently absurd. It took sort of a while for this to become clear to me. But the more I read and the more I engaged, when I started reading Israeli Jewish writers who'd been part of the Nakba in the Haganah, like Uri Avneri, and I was like, oh, bleep. This actually happened. This isn't some Palestinian propaganda. This stuff actually happened. Here are Jewish sources that I can trust that are telling me that they were part of it. And this is what they did, forcibly, pointing guns at people and kicking them out. And, we, in the left Zionist movement, we used to fight with they were called the Beitar movement, the youth movement of what's now the Likud party. We were purity of arms. They were, you did Deir Yassin. We knew about the Deir Yassin massacre where Zionist militias had killed 260 Palestinian women and children. And they would look at us and go, yeah, you think we would have a Jewish state without Deir Yassin? I started to realize that actually they were right. I started to realize that Jabotinsky, whose portrait hangs in Netanyahu's office, by the way, the ideological founder of that movement, was more honest than the left Zionist that I'd venerated. Because he said, this is a colonial movement, it's violent. It's going to require the violent dispossession of the Palestinians and the suppression of any resistance, and the resistance to that dispossession is absolutely natural and to be expected, and we're going to need an iron wall in perpetuity. And I was like, you know what, they're right, and therefore I can't be a Zionist. That's my personal journey from that. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. Okay, activism in South Africa also revealed to me something about media and power. In apartheid South Africa, it's pretty obvious. Who has access to the media? Whose voices are heard? We were doing struggle media, kind of hack media, to be honest. But yeah, there's a line there that's actually important to think about. The line between activism and social justice journalism is very important, and that's about political independence. So, alignment with values, but not with parties, not with personalities. Once you got on that route, you're not doing journalism. But basically, this question of a point of view in media is really, really important. And I use point of view not meaning an opinion, not whether you like Tom Friedman or... Okay, I had to throw him in somewhere. I mean a point of view in the way that cinematographers use the word. Where are they putting the camera? Whose experience of a set of events is being recorded? Now, we can't, if you had a bazillion cameras, when people talk about just the facts, the problem with that isn't, the facts are not a problem. Facts are absolutely indispensable. Like, facts are not a virtue. Facts are an absolute basic. Anything that's not factual is not journalism, and needs to be sort of destroyed, rejected, et cetera, But the definite article, that's where the problem comes in, because there are unlimited facts. Right now in this room, there are probably 1.7 billion facts happening every 30 seconds. Which of them are important? Which of them matter? Which of them are significant? Journalists have to always decide which facts matter. You couldn't write a 700-word story, a 3-minute, you couldn't make an hour-long documentary with all of the facts. You're making choices about which facts are important, significant to a story, and which facts aren't. And whether you know it or not, those facts are being determined by a narrative point of view. Whose facts matter? If you were recovering the closure of an Apple computer factory in southern China, what that looks like from the perspective of a Wall Street investor in Apple versus what that looks like to a low-wage worker at that factory in China, very different set of facts are germane to each of those people. And you're going to make a choice about whose story you're going to tell, which facts matter. If I had time, I don't know. Okay. Do any of you watch football? English football? Thank you. Good. Virtually assisted refereeing, perfect illustration of the problem. Okay, those of you who don't know, basically, for the last couple of seasons, everything that happens on a football field is now recorded by multiple cameras that give a referee, as separate to the one on the field, a set of absolutely unimpeachable facts, right? Like, everything that happened in the last 30 seconds of play is visible to a referee, right? So if something happens, the referee awards a penalty or whatever it is, it goes to the VAR. And these referees sit there with this unimpeachable set of perfect facts, and they get probably about 1/3 of their calls wrong, right? With a perfect set of facts. Because they're having to weight facts. They're having to decide, is what happened in that second more important than that? What was the consequence of this fact? Was that sufficient force to bring the player down? I could spend an hour on this, or anything football related, but I won't. But the point is, facts in themselves don't tell a story. And if you look at the Iraq invasion, that's a perfect example also, where the New York Times eventually apologizes for, ooh, sorry, we believed the wrong facts. or we believe what the government told us about these weapons of mass destruction that Iraq supposedly had. But that was only part of the problem, because France and Germany, just for example, their governments believed exactly the same thing that the US believed and was saying about what Saddam Hussein had, and yet vehemently opposed the war, because they were like, the existence of those weapons does not make invading and occupying Iraq any less insane. And if you look at, if the US military had found a warehouse full of VX missiles in Baghdad, Iraq would have been no less of a cataclysmic disaster than it was. So the question of which facts matter, we're making choices. Let's see. So, when I was at Time, when I was reading Rami and dreaming of a different world, I got this feeling with the editors, like there was the view from nowhere that was adopted as if this is just neutral, values-free, uninvolved, dispassionate journalism, was actually the view from the corridors of power. It was the view from Davos, it was the view from the White House. It was often journalists who would literally pretty much express that their job was to explain the thinking of the government to the public. That they were essentially, there was never any questioning of the underlying assumptions of people in power. And the we was, what are we going to do about Saddam Hussein? I actually heard an editor say that back then. There was a sense of the we are part of the power. We are joined, it's stenographers, really. I mean, if I'm going to be contemptuous, which is hard to resist sometimes. Walter Isaacson, who had been my boss when I began the Time, but he'd moved on to CNN, at the time of the Afghanistan invasion, sends a memo to his foreign correspondents. And this is publicly reported. You can read this piece. The Washington Post has a good piece about it at the time. And what this memo says is like, look, you guys need to stop telling us about civilian casualties in Afghanistan. Like, that is not the story our audience wants to hear. And if you are going to report on any hardships suffered by the Afghan people, you have to make clear that these are a consequence of 9/11 and blame the Taliban for hosting Al-Qaeda, right? Now, people in an Afghan village that just got bombed, no idea what 9/11 was all about, or they know. They just got bombed. And, you see that pattern now. You see it in some of the Western news organizations when it comes to Gaza. Like the most horrific things that happen often are accompanied, well, in the BBC stories, the bottom 3 paragraphs that are, doing what Walter asked for Afghanistan, or, on the webpage it might be, overnight 260 people were killed, but, this happened 3 months ago. Here's a traumatic story from 3 months ago, that as if it's balancing it, right, contextualizing it, legitimizing essentially the violence that is now underway. I'm just trying to see. So coming to Jazeera, because I don't want to run over time. Values-based journalism, like in the the manifesto, the boilerplate stuff that was when I joined Jazeera 10 years ago, was the sense of, it's a misnomer, voice of the voiceless. I hate that because actually nobody's voiceless. What we are is amplifiers of the powerless. That we're making a conscious choice that on our feeds, and particularly when you do the social media feeds, which is where I work, where you're making a choice about balance. You're rebalancing an imbalance out there in the media spaces by injecting voices that you're not going to hear. So on our feeds, you're not going to hear from the Israeli government, you're not going to hear from the US government, you're not going to hear from Hamas, you're not going to hear from the Palestinian Authority. You're going to hear from ordinary people who are living what one of the earlier Director Generals of AJ Plus put it, CNN covers the world from where the missiles are fired, Jazeera covers the world from where the missiles land. Okay, you're going to have the experience of ordinary people where the missiles land, because that's what's missing in the overall media ecosystem. We're making choices to be aware of power and aware of imbalances of power. That balance is not sitting, in an elite space and going, well, we could, be a little bit left and a little bit right. What do people say about slavery? Is slavery good for the economy? Is slavery immoral? No, we're going to actually rebalance the imbalances of whose voices are heard in the global media context. we are also aware that we're writing history, that history is, what's the lions and hunters, until the lions have historians of their own, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That like old proverb, Chenjerai Kumanyika, etc., informing what we do. But if it comes to, you look at covering Gaza, two basic principles. I've got about 2 or 3. A lot of the mainstream Western media is dehumanizing Palestinians systematically, right? It's like, everything from the choice of language. Palestinians die, they're never killed. You talk about Palestinians, you don't talk to Palestinians, you don't hear from Palestinians. There are lots of studies you can all look up, tracking the differentials in the way the human experience of Israelis versus Palestinians is covered in those mainstream media. So we are consciously setting out to humanize, and we're consciously setting out to contextualize where a lot of mainstream media decontextualizes. So, if you followed mainstream accounts, you might be forgiven for thinking, this all started on October 7th. Like, Israel was like a European country. It participates in Eurovision Song Contest and UEFA football. And then, boom, out of the blue, like a bunch of crazy people just attack it. Like, I was very impressed last night, I don't know if any of you watched the Oscars, when Jonathan Glazer, who made Zone of Interest, said, October 7th happened because of the occupation. That's a very, very rare insight to hear on a Hollywood platform. But yes, the sense of history didn't begin on October 7th. This is, as the South Africa, I was very proud, the International Court of Justice submission by South Africa says this starts 75 years ago. This is about a history of dispossession, occupation, etc., of which this is a terrible moment. And we're seeing more terrible moments. But that need to contextualize that you can't tell time by following the second hand of a clock, round and round. You have to know, where is the minute hand, where is the hour hand, and where's the calendar? Where are we at? So yeah, I think just the last thought about social media, because that's our oeuvre. Like, social media requires picking your shots. You don't have the audience's attention. It's not like somebody clicked on you and you have their attention for 30 seconds or a minute or whatever, or that you have a homepage. Your stuff is flying by people on a feed. So you're injecting something into a wider news diet. So you're conscious of that. But just perhaps noticing, I think when we look back on this moment historically, we're going to see that this completely changed the dynamic of the world that we live in. Because it basically means everybody has a camera and everybody can record what they're seeing and they can share it, they can publish it. I mean, sometimes it's a bit frightening. But what you've seen is the gatekeeping effect of traditional institutional media structures has been shattered. Like, when you see senators and Congress people freaking out about TikTok, it's like TikTok is radicalizing American youth, right? Yeah, it's because basically the structures that mediate and that control. I'm not saying, there are plenty of problems and risks and threats. I'm not evangelizing for TikTok here, but what you're seeing is a symptom of a breaking of a structure of hegemony. And that a lot more things become possible. People in power are freaking out. That's always a good thing for journalism. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Wow. I'm floored by how much, thank you so much, Tony. I'm floored by how much you and Rami were able to cover in such a short time. Thank you. So I know that there must be some questions, hopefully. I will reiterate what I had to say about proceeding in a respectful manner, but at the same time, we're here in an educational institution, and you should ask the hard questions. I ask everybody here, if you have thoughts, questions, bring it to us. Sometimes you need a minute to take in what happened, but are there any questions anyone has? Yes, and we'll start out. And please try to keep your questions and comments brief, if you can, so we can get more voices in.
In somewhere like Gaza, where there's journalists dying, how do you balance the responsibility to keep your journalists alive with the duty to report the news?
That's a good. You got thoughts on this? Or? Okay. The question was the responsibility of a news organization to keep its journalists alive. How do you balance that with reporting from Gaza? And I'm not speaking for, I'm thinking like, what do I know about this? I'm not mandated to speak about this. But I think in short, the journalists who are covering Gaza for Al Jazeera all live in Gaza. So it's not like we're deploying people in that we then have a choice of like, well, should you bring them out or whatever. So people who have had the option of leaving have been, I want to stay, this is my community, I want to tell the story. So, I think that's a valid question. Like, all news organizations have an ethical responsibility to their people. So would you deploy someone in Gaza in order to, get a story and put their lives at risk? No, I mean, that would fly in the face of most of the journalistic conventions that I've known, and certainly that apply in Jazeera. I mean, sometimes you're like, oh God, you want to go somewhere, a journalist wants to go somewhere, like, I mean, Haiti would be an extreme example, but places where there's a degree of risk and the journalist really wants to go there, and the risk assessment department says, sorry, no, you can't. Like, we can't send you there. We even had a policy for a long time of not taking freelance, in the period when ISIS was murdering journalists in Syria, you had a lot of freelancers going like, well, I'm going in there, you don't have to assign me, but will you publish my piece when it comes back? And we wouldn't, because we didn't want to incentivize people going and putting themselves at risk. So I 100% agree, where you have the space to make the ethical choice, you don't put people at risk. But when people are living at risk and they want to report on what's happening to them, I think that's kind of what's in play right now.
I'd just add to that, there's a middle ground also between those two dimensions that Tony mentioned. So there are some journalists who know there's a great story, they know it's dangerous, but they want to be there, and it's not their country, it's somebody else's country. They want to be there. And the best example I would give you is the late Anthony Shadid. For those of you who don't know Anthony Shadid, and I suppose many of you are too young to know him, I'd urge you very much to look him up. It's Shadid, Shadid. He's a Lebanese-American from Oklahoma who went overseas for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. And when the Iraq War broke out, and people knew weeks ahead of time when there was going to be this massive assault on Baghdad, which was, 2003? Yeah. So Anthony was there, as were many reporters. And then when the American attack was just a day or two ahead, most American and Western news organizations told their people to leave. It's dangerous. Anthony insisted on staying. His foreign editor at the Washington Post told him and said, Anthony, you got to leave. And Anthony, I knew Anthony well. He was a good friend, and I had him come and spend a year as a writer in residence at the institute I established at the American University of Beirut while he wrote a book. And Anthony told his editor, I'm sorry, I'm staying. This is the story of my life. I've spent my whole life wanting to report accurately about Arab conditions and Arab people and their interactions with the West. And this is the greatest story of my life. And I've prepared my whole life for this story. I'm staying. And his editor said, you stay. They couldn't force him to leave. They just gave him all the assistance he needed to be safe. And he did some of the greatest reporting of any American foreign correspondent of the last century, I would say. He got 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Look up Anthony Shadid Pulitzer Prizes. You'll get lists of his articles and read a few of them. Because he did exactly what Jazeera is doing today. He wanted to be where the bombs were falling, to report the story from the perspective of ordinary people, not the government of Iraq or the army, but ordinary people. And he did it. He did it brilliantly. And it's still a model that people try to copy, but they can't, because he had a special drive. He wanted to report accurately because he had seen, growing up as an Arab American, that the Arab region was not fairly reported, accurately reported in the Western media. And he wanted to do a better job. So sometimes they stay. The huge irony, the terrible, cruel irony, is he died. But he didn't die because of a bomb or an assassination. He died from a horsehair allergy as he was coming out of Syria on a trip to Syria. And he was allergic to horsehair, and his whatever inhaler wasn't strong enough, and he died. So these things happen. So the journalist himself or herself or their self has to decide, is this my job? I mean, this is like Tony said, it's a calling. It's not, you don't do journalism because, you know, it's a job that's available. You do it because you feel it's something useful to do and something satisfying to do. And every journalist has to define how they do journalism. And like I said, why they do it and what they're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, if you feel, yeah. Yes, always let the applause ring if you feel it. All right, who else said, okay, in the back I have a question all the way, yes.
Hi, I had a question for Tony. It's more about like what you talked about, your personal journey. Like you mentioned your shift away from what you called like left Zionism. And I was just wondering like how you reconcile, because like I assume that like a lot of your family and like the community that you'd surround yourself with leading up to that point was like also along those same lines. And how do you like, how did they react and how do you reconcile with like shifting away from that entire community, I guess?
My father was in B'nai B'rith. I don't know, you know that organization, right? So he was an alternate delegate to the Cape Jewish Board of Deputies. This is in 1982 when Israel's invaded Lebanon. Anyway, they're having a meeting on the question of anti-Semitism at the University of Cape Town. So he goes to this meeting, and like Exhibit A is something I've written in the student newspaper about Israel's invasion of Lebanon. So, you know, he can see the absurdity, obviously, of the idea that I'm an anti-Semite. But, you know, I mean, I've got some choice Yiddish curse words for anybody who wants to argue. But, yeah, I mean, you know, you become a bit of a family outcast, but, you know, I mean, it wasn't hard for me. I was sort of at odds with a lot of my family anyway. And then I had an uncle in Paris, weirdly. He was my father's cousin, who had survived the war in Poland and had settled in Paris. And he was editing a Jewish cultural magazine, and he pretty much did the same thing. And I was like, okay, there's a bit of family tradition here. But, you know, I went back to Cape Town a couple of weeks ago. My sister was like, you know, I really wish I could change my last name because I'm really sick of having to explain to people why you're not an anti-Semite. But I think, you know what, it's like that sense of you're betraying the tribe, as in, if you have a tribal view of Judaism, I don't. And I'm amazed, actually, how widespread that much more universal sense, that social justice sense, is pervasive now. So you have thousands of people turning out for Jewish Voices for Peace actions. And by the way, you know, when I'm in Doha, the way those have resonated throughout the Arab region is quite incredible. That people actually seeing that this is not about Jews versus Muslims or Jews versus Arabs. This is basically about justice and injustice. And there are many Jews willing to put them, you know, put their bodies on the line in some way to challenge this. So, you know, I get the sense of those dynamics are changing generationally in Jewish families and communities. But I'm sure for anyone here who faces the same thing is going to have their own version of that story. And some of it is people have, I mean, you know, I know people struggle, and particularly people who have family in Israel right now. It's tough because they are very traumatized. Whatever the context that's produced this, people have suffered very real trauma, and so, yeah, those conversations are difficult, but I think they're important. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to get as many voices as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So we had one comment here. Is anyone else? Do you have a comment? So let's take both of those questions first, and then we'll just maybe see if we can address them together. Yes. So yeah.
Hello. Okay. I actually had a question about NYU because since October 7th, in the emails I've received from NYU, Palestine has been mentioned 3 times and Gaza twice. 4 of those total were for this event, and 1 was for a similar one in November. In addition, downstairs in the display of books, there's a book that proclaims itself as left Zionist, and it was front and center until a few weeks ago, and it's still there now. What does that tell you about the message NYU is sending to its journalism students?
Okay. Do you got that question? Okay. And then
I'm being slightly pedantic by asking this because we kind of have referenced it.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me better? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm being slightly pedantic, and I would like to recognize that. But my question is really to Tony's point, but to both of what you were speaking. Is it the institution's responsibility to find those voices, especially like in Palestine, where there is an active suppression of that point of view? Or do you think that you're just there to hold the space for people that come to you, if that is a lucid question? Thank
Great.
you.
Okay, so these are different questions. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, I know these are different, so.
I mean, I don't know about you. I can't really speak to the NYU question, as I have no idea, or, what the institution's obligations are. This is out of my ken, as they say in the UK. I don't know if you have.
Well, I don't know any of the details either. The only thing I would say for any institution, like I was talking before about any journalist, and whether this applies to NYU or to Columbia or to St. John's, I have no idea. But what I would say is that any institution of learning, research, and knowledge probably has a obligation, a professional and a moral obligation to share knowledge as widely as possible within a civil and orderly and respectful context. And I can tell you, I've been doing this all my life. 50 years I've been debating with B'nai B'rith and Hillel and Israeli ambassadors, and it's not a problem. You can talk to somebody wearing a keffiyeh, or somebody with a Star of David, or a kuppah, or a shirt with a watermelon on it. You can talk to them without being in a frenzy, if you really want to engage them in a serious, rational, and important discussion. And it's not a conversation. I always criticized Hillary Clinton because all she'd say is, we got to have a conversation about it. We don't do, in the Middle East, we don't do conversations. We do negotiations. You negotiate with people all the time. And a negotiation doesn't mean that you're going to have a drag-out, knockdown, drag-out fight. It means you have different views on the topic, but both of your views need to be heard. And only when you hear the views of the other side can you both determine, well, where is the validity in each side? And it may be that one side has a little bit more validity than another on a certain point. And at another point, the other side will have more validity. But this only comes from engaging people. And this is what universities and schools should do.
Yeah, let me thank you so much, Rami. And I actually am going to speak to this. I'm going to say that, it is true. I've seen evidence that of a lot of students being called in for disciplinary proceedings, and faculty and people being suspended. And from my standpoint, and everyone has to get the data and make up your own mind, but the way that people are called in and disciplined is actually unacceptable for an educational institution, because what you're doing is essentially scaring. Quite frankly, I was scared to put this program on. So if my university has not, and my college has not communicated to me in a way that says it's okay to put on a program like this to give my students the best education they can, that means something's wrong with the environment. So that's one thing I'll say on the NYU thing. We had another very important question. Do you want to reiterate your question just to make sure it comes through,
Should I just yell?
Yeah, or no. We have mics for you. Thank you, yes.
Sorry, oh my gosh. Thank you, guys. So essentially my question is, when you're in a place of conflict like this, where I think, in terms of physically in Palestine, but also in the Western world, like with the New York Times, the recent Silent Screams article, like there is an active suppression of Palestinian voices, in my humble opinion. Do you think it's the responsibility of journalistic institutions to, either with journalists they already have on the ground or sending people in, to actively seek more voices to supplement the narrative that's being told? Or do you think it's more the responsibility to just hold space for people who have already come forward and would like to share their story?
Okay, my short answer to that would be No, I mean, I think you have you're making a choice about how to write history. I would never read a history that was just basically the people in power. Here's what Stalin said about, 1943 versus here's what Hitler said about 1943 versus some lower level officials. Like, I'd want to know, what did the invasion of Belarus feel like on the ground where my ancestors had lived? But so the short answer is that, no, you absolutely want to find the voices. You want to realize that's what's missing in your story and find them. You have to be sensitive. You have to be careful. You have to establish the authenticity of people you're talking to. I mean, one thing I noticed in people covering Afghanistan, when the US pulled out, all of the Western media was basically hearing from people who spoke English. Now, it's an obvious choice. You want people who are going to be able to communicate with your audience, but you're not maybe taking account of what that tells you about the person's class position, their orientation. Like, I think some journalists finally went out into the rural areas and who could speak Pashto and got this completely different story from women in the rural areas about the US leaving and so on. So yes, you have to go and find the people if you don't have them, but you have to also be careful about, a number of factors that are going to shape, a number of safeguards you want to put in, I think. Yeah.
I would add that in a situation like that, say you're in a foreign country and you're reporting on a conflict, or it may not be a conflict, whatever, there's going to be 100 different views in that country. You're going to talk to maybe 15 or 20 people, and you'll be able to quote maybe 2 or 3 in your story. So your job as a journalist, I believe, is you do as much research as you can, talking to people, reading stuff, watching TV, whatever. Find out as accurately as you can the basic 2 or 3 dominant perceptions in society. So in the US today, if you ask people, what do you think about immigration? You're going to get 50 different viewpoints. But there's probably 4 or 5 that capture the majority of those views, for or against, whatever it may be. Your job is to distill that wide range of views into 2 or 3 that capture at least a majority sentiment, and pass them on to your audience, your readers or viewers. So I'd say yes, it is your responsibility to go out and seek views in society, but you're not a tape recorder only. You're not just getting a quote, putting it in the paper. You're talking to 50 people and distilling from that what you see are the big trends. Because this is not a chemical reaction where you put A chemical with B chemical and you get C gas. This is a amorphous, very fluid, unpredictable situation of human beings. That's why I mentioned in my initial comments the deeper human emotions. We're not identifying the color of people's hair or their skin or their eyes. We're touching on the inner sentiments, the historical traumas, and the deep complex identities, national and ethnic and other religious identities that people have. These are not easy things to quantify. And you need to stay away from the trap, the danger also of pegging people into, Shiites and Sunnis. So for the last 25, 30 years, we've heard of Shiites and Sunnis fighting each other all the time. I tell you, growing up here a few years when my dad was with the UN here, but in the Middle East, all the years of my working, I didn't know the difference between my Sunni and Shiite friends. It simply was not an issue in most of these countries until the Iranian Revolution, and then you had a different reality. So you don't want to pigeonhole people based on their ethnicity or religion, because as you all know from your friends and your families and your classmates, that people who you think share a view actually have different views. This is one of this is part of the poetic side of journalism, for you to be able to touch the inner feelings and sentiments of people, of many people, and convey these accurately to your audiences. It's hard, but when it works, it's very satisfying and can be very useful. It could have saved, the United States huge amounts of money and blood in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, and now who knows what's going to happen with the American army going into. The United States Army was fighting in 6 different locations in the Middle East in the last couple of months. 6 different people were shooting at the U.S. and the U.S. was shooting back at them. And this is quite extraordinary. So you can help countries avoid that kind of waste by better reporting, more complete reporting, more nuanced reporting, and keeping in mind that this is not a chemistry class. There is no answer at the back of the book. You're conveying humanity, and humanity is a fluid concept. But this is, again, the great joy and the magic of journalism.
Thank you so much. Here's what I want to do. This may not be possible, but is there anyone else who had a question that was not addressed that they would like to? We have 2 people. 3. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, for those, I know that class is technically over, so for those who have other commitments and need to leave, I'm going to ask that you do so quietly, that you quietly engage with the TA, make sure you get attendance credit. And is it okay, Tony and Rami, to stay here for about another 5 to 10 minutes to address these other questions? Thank you so much. Okay. We'll just take a minute. Could we go and could the people who had questions raise your hands? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Do we see who they are? Oh, okay. Why don't we go over to the side here first? Yes. All right. Yes, nice and loud, please.
Hi. So I was just wondering, considering everything that's going on in Gaza, and you said you talked to a lot of Palestinian journalists who are on the ground. I was just wondering how to, as journalists, with your emotions, to basically how you make sure your emotions stay in check, and how to make sure the journalists you work with, you can't hear?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I'll repeat the question just because. Folks, if I could ask you just to be quiet, we're still continuing the program for a second. All right, thank you. All right, so I believe the question was basically when you're reporting on Gaza or this conflict, you yourself feel emotions as you're working with journalists. How do you deal with your own emotions, keeping them where they need to be for you to perform the job? Is that
no?
That's
My
not
question was about specifically Palestinian journalists and their emotions and how to
Got you. Okay, specifically Palestinian journalists. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a really good question, and it's a really difficult area because we have, at AJ Plus specifically, and certainly much more so even in Jazeera, a large number of Palestinian journalists. So people for whom, one of my colleagues the other day sends me a clip about, from a newspaper reporting in Gaza about a detention camp in Gaza near Khan Yunis, where the screams of people being tortured are, being heard by the community. And he's like, yeah, my uncle and cousins are in that camp. So it's extremely personal. And, I have colleagues who liken, their experience to having their skin flayed every day. That, people are not sleeping. Because I see colleagues, they're tweeting at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And it's obviously people are not sleeping, particularly the ones with loved ones in Gaza. So I think it's been incredibly difficult. And we've tried always to create psychological support structures in the way that we did also during BLM, during the uprising, for, people being personally, video editors who have to edit violent footage every day. So what the audience is seeing is only part of what's being cut away. They're seeing everything. And, that takes a toll. So we're very mindful of rotating people and taking care, making psychological services available to people, rotating people so that they're not overburdened with those things. What we find, certainly with the Palestinian colleagues, is there's a real desire, because this is one of the few avenues where people can actually make a difference. and feel that they're doing something to tell the story, to elevate the voices, and to share the trauma. So people have not wanted to sort of step away, but as managers, yeah, you definitely want to, this has been going on for 5 months, and people are never going to be the same. But, they feel like their community is never going to be the same. So there's been a real desire to bear witness, I think is the term. But yes, people are suffering. We do our best to manage that. Nobody's in a situation with us, as far as I know, where they're feeling pressure to actually stay on the story. It's like people want to stay on the story. You have to sometimes go, maybe you want to take a day off kind of thing. But it's a very important story because, yes, I don't think this has ever happened before, that you've had like a genocidal episode being recorded in real time by so many cameras. And every day we see things that are unimaginable. And people for whom that's their commute, they can't switch off. They're not going to, watch something on Netflix to decompress because it's family. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Rami,
I just want to get some other voices in. So, yes, I see. I don't know the order, but yeah, you want to first? Yes, and then.
Yeah, it's
okay, cool. Yeah, and then will you? I'm sorry. Thank you.
It's another question though. I was wondering, it's a question for Tony.
Could you speak up just a little bit, please?
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering how much your personal history of apartheid activism in South Africa informs your coverage of the Middle East today, and if you could speak a little bit on the ongoing, is Israel an apartheid state discourse?
Yeah. Well, actually, yeah. Let's take a couple of. I'm sorry if you don't mind. This person I think up front has been waiting for a while, and I would just want to make sure we get them in so people don't feel, Yes.
And you'll make a list.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes, I will. Yes.
Okay. I have more of a broad question.
Louder.
Okay. I have a more broad question just because of your enormous experience and expertise. I've noticed just how much the media response since October 7th has been, a little bit bigger than the media response since what happened on February 24th, 2022, the invasion of Ukraine. And I was wondering, of course, every death is important, whether it's, a Ukrainian, a Palestinian, an Indian, an American. And I was wondering if it's a more general news outlet, how does a reporter decide whose death to report today and why?
Okay.
Besides what?
Yeah, how does a reporter decide whose death is more important and whose death to report on? Yeah.
Thank you very much. All important questions, and I realize there's some other ones. So let's handle these two, and then we'll get a couple more into the mix. And I appreciate your patience. The first question was about how your experience in South Africa influenced your reporting on this issue. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, mainly into the broader apartheid discussion regarding.
Oh, right, because people apply the concept of apartheid to Israel. So how does your experience in South Africa inform whether or not that applies, et cetera?
Yep.
That's the first question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could have a whole session on this. But I think in general, yes, 100%. But the basic the humane value and the way of looking at a settler colonial society, which, I was long before it became a consensus in the international human rights community that Israel is an apartheid state, including the Israeli blue chip B'Tselem, it was obvious to me. I'd been warned when I was still in the left Zionist movement by people on kibbutz saying, this was when Begin had just come to power, look, they want to keep the settlers in the West Bank. That's going to mean permanent apartheid. It was kind of, these were South African Zionists warning of that. So yes, I think absolutely. I do think it's important that we understand the differences between South Africa and Israel, even though both are apartheid states. There's a very different, and look, every settler colonial entity has its own history, trajectory. And, if I want to summarize this very, very crudely, in South Africa, the settlers took the land and compressed the indigenous people into smaller and smaller pockets of land where they could, were struggling to feed them, to do subsistence agriculture, and then charge them cash taxes in a cashless economy. Why? Because what they actually wanted was to enslave those people in a cash economy as cheap labor, the migrant labor system, etc. So basically, the South African industrial economy was built with black labor. In other words, the settlers wanted the land and the people as a captive labor force. In Palestine, they wanted the land, but they wanted to get rid of the people. So what's the difference, in terms of the political geography? If there's a general strike in Soweto in 1976, the whole economy shuts down, right? If there's a general strike in the West Bank, Israel can more or less carry on. It's not, in the same way, often South Africans will tell you what was suffered in South Africa wasn't even a small percentage of the violence that's suffered by Palestinians. Because, if the South African regime had bombed Soweto, that's it. Like, the economy stops running. Like, nobody's at work the next day. They couldn't afford to do that. They were killing lots of people. But the kind of wholesale carnage that you see in Gaza, even in the West Bank, was not possible for the South African regime. The third element that brings us to then, and this much more open question, is how does it end? Because in South Africa, you can see pathways created by a common society, a common economy, political economy, points to a set of possible outcomes, which in Palestine, it's harder to envisage. I'm not in the solutionism business. I don't want to comment on, I can see traps in solutionism. But the fundamental thing that's missing there is that solution discussions usually exclude the Palestinians. Nobody accepts, it's like a colonial discussion. It's like, how can we manage the Palestinian issue? That's the US-led conversation with Arab authoritarian regimes brought into that conversation. But it's never about the people. So for my side, the principle that's got to be the same is that the Palestinians need to decide. They need to decide who their leaders are and what their future looks like. That basic sovereignty, anti-colonial sovereignty, and take it from there. I don't know if Rami wants
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that point, which carries right on from what Tony said. The Palestinian people, the Palestinian Arabs, from the beginning of this conflict, which I said is a 100 years conflict, we're now in 2024. It was in 2023 that the mandate officially came into force, in 1923, 100 years ago, that the mandate came into force by which Great Britain controlled the historic land of Palestine, which all of Palestine, the West Bank, and including East Jordan east of the river, which became a separate Jordan. But from the very beginning, from the Balfour Declaration, which was the seminal document that the British issued in 1917, the Palestinians were not mentioned. They were invisible people. Like, I imagine many of you have read Ralph Ellison's great novel, Invisible Man. If you haven't, read it. And we were invisible men and women. And we're still invisible men and women. When you get people like Jared Kushner and Donald Trump and now Joe Biden and Blinken, they're coming up with all these ideas, and the Palestinians are not playing a major role in this. And the Israelis certainly are not negotiating with any serious credible Palestinians for the future of Palestine. So this is one of the problems in this conflict, and it needs to be appreciated as a reason for the continued conflict. The conflict has gone on for 100 years, and this is one of the most important reasons. There's others as well. There was a question about who decides.
Ukraine, yeah, in Ukrainian coverage, just looking at, I think the person who asked the question is claiming you're seeing a disparity of coverage, and then you're thinking about the decision making about how do we decide what gets covered in that context. Is that generally it? I know I'm doing a little violence to your question, so yeah, all right.
Yeah, and there was a specific question about, how does a reporter decide on which death to report on, I think came up. These are not easy, straight questions to answer. They're never black and white. They're always kind of fudged, and there are so many factors that we mentioned in our initial comments that the reporters the editors, the correspondents, and then the advertisers and the board of trustees and the business managers, the circulation managers of the newspapers or TV. There's so many people involved in the media process that may have a say in this. They might say, look, play down this coverage because it's going to cause us to lose advertising, or people will cancel their subscriptions, or they'll stop watching us, they'll go watch somebody else on TV. This happens all the time. I experienced it myself in the context of the Middle East, and when I was editing newspapers in Lebanon and Jordan, which is different than, but I'd have the editors say, look, play down this, story because it's going to cause us problems with certain Arab countries that support us or advertisers that whatever. So these decisions have like 20 different elements in them, and they're not straightforward. But this is, again, the role of the journalist being the person on the spot, the correspondent. Presumably that person knows the realities better than anybody back home in the editorial office. And therefore, his or her views should be given extra weight in deciding what's important and what's to report.
Yeah, you want to just...
I just want to add one
yeah.
quick insight on the question of, say, comparing Ukraine and Palestine. I mean, I think partly there would be a question of scale. And if you look at the way Ukraine was covered 2 years ago versus now, so there's that element of fatigue and also frozen conflict. The second point would be, this is more challenging to think about, but the people in Ukraine who are being killed by Russia, sort of designated enemy that the US is supposedly helping fight, etc. And so some of those stories will be deployed as kind of, putting pressure on Congress to release funds, etc. In the case of Palestine, the people being killed are being killed with US weapons. So that it creates a different dynamic. And also that the editorial, structure clearly identifies with Israel. I mean, this is not, all of their Palestine, their Israel correspondents always have children in the army. There's the sense of like, this is our community, like this is, villa in the jungle, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think there's that real identification with Israel in a way that probably isn't with Ukraine beyond the sort of broad Cold War kind of objectives.
Thank you. So we have folks who have been really patient. I have one comment here in the back, and then this. Let's take both of those again, just because I want to at least get the questions in the room. So first, yes.
Hello, my name is Raza. Thank you so much, first of all, for coming here. The US media has historically had a pretty big role in the global south, we can say. A lot of this value judgment that we see that authoritarian governments are there and there is no press freedom in Iraq or Pakistan has come from the US media. This is how this image has been created. And in the last 5 months, we have seen that there is no difference in at least the press freedom in terms of how you cover conflicts. And Gaza has particularly shown that even after the deaths of 12,000 people, not choosing to be fair about it is a choice. It's not about they're not being able to do it. If you can do it in the case of Ukraine and Russia, if you know the adjectives to put for a person who fires at an unarmed group of people, then you should also do it for the IDF, for the Israeli military as well. So I think personally that the US media has not just been a participant, but an accomplice in the genocide of the people of Palestine. But my question is that this has led to a lot of, I would say, people are starting to lose trust. This happened after the Iraq War as well. The New York Times apologized, but there was still some sort of legacy attached to it. People like me from Pakistan coming here with the dream that one day I'll be a staffer for New York Times. After all this while, people like me have lost all trust. We don't want to join the New York Times anymore. We'd rather go back to Pakistan and play cricket. But you've been in the media. You've seen decades of how the US media has progressed. What is the sense in the room right now? Are they actually worried that people are not trusting us anymore? Are they worried that people are showing up outside the New York Times office with a charge sheet that you are accomplice in a genocide? Or do they still not care like what happened after the Iraq War or countless wars that the US has been waging in the last, I would say, a century and a half. So what is going on inside media organizations? Universities have been accomplices. No one is talking about Palestine. Journalism institutions are not talking about Palestine. There are good professors like the ones we have here, but they're on the fringe. They are not being allowed to talk. And in classrooms, we're talking about how to report on a food cart in New York, while like 3,000 people have died in the last 1 week. So what is happening? I'm new here, so I don't understand. So if you can help me understand how this works here. Thank you.
That's a really important question, which takes a long time to answer, but we don't have a lot of time. So quick comments. Clearly, this Gaza crisis has opened up important new dimensions of everything, relations within Palestine and within Israel, between Palestine and Israel, Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia. The whole world has been impacted by this conflict, both by the Hamas attack on October 7 and the relentless Israeli-American assault on Gaza. Since I say Israeli-American because it can only be done if Israel gets the American arms, money, and diplomatic shelter at the UN. So it is seen as an Israeli-American assault on Gaza, and this has shaken up really every dimension of this all over the world. And we don't know where it's going to lead to, but we can tell that it has already opened for discussion issues that had been closed for many years. And the whole question of the relationship between Zionism to Arabism, the relationship between the State of Israel to the Palestinian people's rights, these questions are now out in the open. And not only that, but two really important new things have happened that have not been sufficiently reported on or appreciated here in the United States. And I was born here, and I've been coming and going to the United States all my life. There's two really, really new dramatic developments that need to be better reported on and analyzed by the press. Not just the press, but also by schools, by churches, by mosques, by synagogues, everybody. The first is that the Palestine issue has become a domestic American political electoral force. This is unprecedented. We saw it in Michigan, we saw it in Montana, it's going to happen elsewhere. And it's not because it's Palestine. It's because the coalition of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Hispanics, progressive Jews, labor unions, other people, a coalition that historically has been the core of the Democratic Party is telling the Democratic Party, we don't support you because of what you're doing in Gaza. So this is really unprecedented, and they showed their force in some of these primaries. The second amazing development is that Palestine has now become one of 4 leading global issues that resonate widely, deeply, and regularly across the entire world. And those issues are Black Lives Matter, which is racial justice, Me Too, gender justice, climate justice, and Palestine. To the point now where you get all over the world people demonstrating, taking countries to court, taking people to the International Court of Justice. Palestine has become a global issue. And that explains, I think, some of the intensity of sentiments you see both in Israel and the United States and some Western supporters of the Israeli assault on Gaza, but also among people around the world, which is this is the last anti-colonial struggle in the world. This is the last anti-colonial battle. If the colonial struggle in Palestine can be resolved equitably, and I'm using very careful words to not say, how to solve it. I know how to solve it, but I'm speaking in a dispassionate, super dispassionate way so that it creates ideas in your minds that you then go and think about these and discuss them. If we can resolve the conflict in Palestine between Zionism and Arabism and end the settler colonial process and restore the justice and rights for all people concerned, then we can safely say that the big residue of 18th century world colonialism has finally been put to bed. This is why this issue generates so much passion around the world, and will continue to. The floodgates have been opened. Legal cases, court cases, media stuff. Every time a government leader in England or in the United States and other countries goes to do a public event, he or she is confronted by demonstrators. So these are really important new elements that capture the enormity of this situation, way beyond the little piece of land called Palestine. And this is something that we need to keep our eyes on, but also keep discussing openly and honestly and candidly, but also with care and with dignity.
Thank you.
Just
Yes,
one thing,
yes.
because your question was about the New York Times, and do they listen? And the short answer is they do. Look what happened over the Black Lives Matter period. The New York Times was forced to acknowledge certain things. Didn't happen immediately, but the popular pressure, the New York Times has to believe in itself that it's fair. It so patently isn't. And so all of that pressure actually resonates. It'll take some time, but don't ease up.
Yes, all right. Very patiently you waited. I think we have your question. Why don't we just take that and then we'll see. Yeah, okay.
Hello, my name is Maya. So earlier, you guys were speaking about the concept of like fatigue about these types of events, and I know that we've been talking about how essentially what's happening in Palestine has opened the floodgates. But something I've been very concerned about recently, like speaking among my peers who aren't as impassioned about this, is I feel like I'm concerned that there is a feeling of like fatigue and like the reporting. Like I'm wondering, something I've been struggling with is like how to continue reporting on what's happening in Palestine without committing an act of like perversion of the topic, making it something that's newsworthy or trying to sensationalize it, right? While still impelling people to be, to keep listening and reading about the issue.
Just one comment on the issue of reporting on Palestine internationally, which is we have to always keep in mind the ultimate target of the reporting, which is the audience. So if you're a newspaper or TV, your audience who's reading or watching what you produce, a lot of them are not interested in Palestine. They don't care about it. Like there's issues in the world that are really important, but I don't pay attention to them. All of us, we have limited time, so we focus on things that are important to us. If the audiences are not interested in something, it's not going to be reported on. And we see this happening slowly with the downturn in the coverage of Ukraine and increase in Gaza because of the obvious nature of these two conflicts. One has suddenly become a global accusation of genocide in front of the world's biggest court. So audiences matter. If audiences don't care about something, the media is probably not going to respond to them report them very much. So that's something that's that's one of the elements of that journalists and editors have to weigh as they do their job. But there's finally one point, which is that the media also should, I believe, and this may be a little arrogant, but I believe the media should have a responsibility to point out to audiences why some issue is important, why the Rohingya is important, why Cyprus is important, or whatever, Palestine, without drumming it, beating them over the head with it. So part of the job of the mass media is public education, or it used to be, but not so much now. But I think it should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think we struggle with that. We have to find ways. We're lucky in the sense of that human-based storytelling. I don't know if you watch our stuff at all, but Bisan Auda, I mean, she's just priceless, because here is someone the audience connects with. She's young, she's living this reality in Gaza, and she's just chronicling. This is what today, hi, it's day 20, whatever, I'm alive. This is what I'm doing today, this is who I'm seeing. It's like you are there, so that makes a certain kind of connection. But yes, we all, if we did the same story every day, like here's some person looking for buried, people buried under the rubble. If it looks the same, yes. I mean, you have to figure out ways to bring people into the story. And it's a creative challenge. I just want to share one thing that I saw yesterday that I thought was absolutely brilliant, which was Leila Al-Haddad. I don't know if you know her, Gaza mom. She's a food writer from Gaza. And she wrote a piece in Saveur. And I mean, Saveur is like the ultimate foodie, whatever. I mean, I'm a foodie. But I don't read Saveur. I was once offered a job there. I went to Time instead, like fates. But she's writing about summagia, this dish, this lamb stew that is Palestinians made during Ramadan. It's a festive meal. But the peg of the story is that the aunt who taught her how to make it was killed in an airstrike in November. But that's it's a beautiful story. It's very moving. She's also bringing a different audience who's reading foodie magazines to here's the reality of Gaza. But it's not trite. It's very heartfelt and personal. So yeah, personal stories definitely, and angles that are a little unexpected, but that's not telling a story that's unrelated to the horror, and very much related, but via a platform that draws people in that might not be paying attention. We're looking for more of those.
Yes, thank you. We have one last question. We'll close it out. Thank you. Thanks for staying, folks. Thanks to my speakers for your endurance. We have one more question, a last question over here. Also, thanks to James and Adrian. I know we're trickling past time a little bit. Thank you.
Hi. Before anything, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much both for your time. What I wanted to ask is, I'm Puerto Rican. I was there for Hurricane Maria. I saw horrors at the age of 14 and 15 that the world never saw. On situations like this with an ongoing genocide where imagery is so important, how do you choose what to show and potentially how much is too much to show in terms of just the raw violence of it?
Great question.
Yeah, we have a lot of experience with this, and there are a number of factors that you want to consider. So you want to consider, what's editorially important, but that's not exploiting people's suffering, and that it's not so horrific that the audience is going to turn away. You want to measure that ratio, and it's an ongoing balance. And then there's the issue, if you're publishing on social media, the gatekeeping of the algorithms is appalling. Like, so much is age-gated on YouTube. Anything that shows any kind of physical suffering, immediately YouTube age gates, and then the reach, because of the way the algorithm behaves, means that that's not getting any momentum, it's not picking up and traveling. So you're always balancing that. And then, obviously it's traumatic for the viewers, traumatic for the people processing, but you do make calls of like, people need to see this, because this actually, the intimate horror of every day is we've got a piece in the works now, just what's shown and what's not shown on Israeli TV. That is pretty revealing. Like, Israeli TV is showing nothing of what we see. Like, absolutely nothing. Like, that movie that won the Oscar, Zone of Interest? Like, in some ways, just that sense of, cultivated indifference, like, of a society to what that society is engaged in across the world. That was there before October 7th, and it hasn't really changed, other than, for people to, we were attacked, we were innocent, we weren't doing anything to anyone, and then the Nazis came. That's literally what's going on. So, yeah, I'm not giving you a satisfactory answer. It's something we grapple with. You're taking into account editorial choices, balances, but then also you need to beat the algorithm or beat its efforts to trap you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Wow. I'm deeply, deeply humbled and grateful to you, Rami, to Tony, for your insights and for your reporting. I'm glad we have this recorded, because there's so much to watch and to catch up on and learn. Thank you to all the people that put this on again. One person I did not shout out is Azadeh, a professor here, and she runs our global journalism concentration. She absolutely made the connection and is a behind-the-scenes force behind this. Thank you to Tom Sayers, not Tom Sawyer. That's horrifying and will be deleted out. Adrian and James, Lisa Lorang, and other people. And thanks again. And and to my class, make sure you get your attendance credit, and have a happy spring break.